Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1311. Aleph Shiur Aleph, 1311. And the discussion is around transforming, illuminating, and transforming the darkness of existence, the darkness within our very consciousness. So to understand that, we have to understand what darkness is. So the Rebbe Rasha brought the two opinions, which he actually said are not two opinions, actually two elements in darkness. One, that it's very personality, what he calls Shiur b'fnei atzmei, that it's an entity of its, and the second is personality, that it's hedera eir. It is the absence of light, which he translated, that means there's the etzem hacheshech, there's a very core thing that it's dark, it's a state of being, just like there's a tree, just like there's light, there's dark. And then masha hacheshech machshech ala eir, the darkness darkens the light, shemaylim alov, it conceals it, umagbil oisei, and limits its flow, umenei spashtus, three different expressions, and it impedes or blocks the expression or extension of the revelation of the Oir. And he said, "V'yuvan zeh will understand it al derech mashal, with how the faculties manifest within the human body, within the limbs and organs of our body. So the way the faculties are on their own, they're unlimited," he said, and they are essentially ethereal, ruchnis, like Lamayla and Gan Eden. They can relate to and understand even the mahus of Elikus, he called it, the mahus of the Eir Eliki, the very personality of the Eir Eliki, because it's not affected by anything physical or tangible. But when the faculties come inside the human body, meaning when the soul manifests within the person, and the faculties of the soul, each one resides in its particular container or limb or organ within the human body. So the words he uses, then it stops with boim b'hakshama. It comes in a more tangible, more, I said more in a more substance, in a more palpable way. Hakshama means more materialistic, essentially. Because the koyach ha-seichel ein berech klal lahaskil, the power of seichel within the human brain, within the brain, the physical brain, doesn't have the power to conceive ideas and understand as it is on its own when it's not connected to and not limited by the body. And the same thing with Ava v'yira. The love and reverence of the soul is in a state of bittul b'mitzias gavei v'nailis ma'id. But when it comes into the human being, then it has its limitations. So the first thing is, on a qualitative level, it's only the mitzias of Elikus, the close haskoli b'chinas hamitzias levad. So it's no longer the muhus, it's just the existence. So we could understand that God exists. That's why there's the whole contemplation he spoke about earlier, that nothing creates itself and that the divine energy sustains us and is within us, and all the different aspects of the contemplation that he discussed that even the animal soul could understand. And definitely the divine soul, even as it's manifest in the human body, in the mind and in the heart, can relate to and understand. But that's all on a level of Metzius. That's one difference. But Hasagas Hamus Nisalam Lagamri Bislapshazes, but the Mahus has been completely concealed. So that the mind cannot understand in this world, except he did qualify the Riyas Ein HaSeichel, but it's also not Riyas HaMahus. And then he added, V'askolahi b'hagbola. It's also limited. In addition to its qualitative shift, it's also far more finite. B'hagbola kama shebiyacholte, how much he could understand according to commensurate to the Chemer HaMeach, to the very matter of the brain, of the mind. And that's where we stopped. We're going to go now to the parentheses on page 1311. Now, all this is coming to explain, as an example, He hasn't yet concluded the explanation, but it's coming to explain, just to keep the flow, that what darkness does to light. So we'll see how he spells that out shortly or soon, whenever he spells it out. It may take a little while. I'm not sure where he does that. Okay. But for sure, what we're talking here is clearly part of the whole discussion, because remember, the whole goal is to radiate. So yes, there is a descent. The soul does get concealed and its faculties get somewhat concealed and limited by its manifestation in the body. But our job, as we learned earlier, is to actually stimulate and activate the mind to contemplate on the godliness and the divine and counter that darkness. But he's not spelled that out yet. I'm just pointing out that this discussion is not just an example. I said yesterday, it's actually part of the very discussion that he had earlier about the neshama, the nefesh alekis, and nefesh abamis, and how we are in status quo on our own. It's concealed, and then we reveal this Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom through the flame of God is the soul of the human being. That begins to radiate and illuminate, and that we can relate to that the real essence of existence is not materialism, but the divine energy within it. But we'll get back to that as well. So now the Rebbe Rashab concerns himself with this issue. We just said that the mind, as it functions within the body, meaning the mind that we have, the physical mind that we use to understand things, a soul within a body, is both on a qualitative level lower and on a quantitative level limited compared to the way the seichel would be if it was not manifest in this container called the chemer hameach. So he's going to qualify and say, well, 1 second. Does the koyach not have any limitation on its own? Is it only due to its manifestation within the body, within the chemer hameach? So this is what he's going to address right now. So he says, v'hagam, and even though sheyesh hagbolu b'zeh, that there's also a certain parameter and limitation, gam ba'koyach mitzad atzmei, also the very koyach haseichel, not just the koyach haseichel, because when it's like you could say the koyach haseichel is that infinite energy that went into a finite container called the brain. So obviously, the seichel will only work in a finite level, not because it itself is finite, but because right now it's inside of a box. It's like electricity. Electricity doesn't have any boundaries. I'm just giving you an example. But when it's contained in an appliance, obviously it's going to be limited compared to how it would be on its own when it's not confined. But this is not the case. Also, the koyach mitzad atzmei, there's a hagbala. Hainu mitzad mekoyrei. Also, the faculty on its own, meaning due to its own very source, also has a limit. So it's not only due to the container, meaning that it's manifesting inside the organ or the limb, the physical body of the person. Ukiyadua, sheyesh chilukim, baskola vasoga. We know there's differences in conceiving and understanding and comprehension. Lifi eifon hatziyur, in other words, even in the original flow of the seichel itself, not due to its container, when it's being drawn down, it already has a different so-called shapes. I mean, means seer doesn't mean a physical shape. It means there's different ways and different structures of how this haskola is coming from hamshachan elemes demokar seichel. So if seichel right here that we have is seichel hagali. Let me put it more. I'll put it more like in 3 levels. There's the seichel that we relate to, the conscious mind that was right now conceiving and understanding and comprehending ideas. That's the seichel b'moyach hagashmi. We just said it's limited. Fine. It's limited due to the moyach, the physical keli. But he's saying it's not only the physical keli. The koyach itself even from its source in the supraconscious. That's what he means by Amshach and Alamas of Mokra Seichel. Sometimes that's called Koyach HaMaskil, sometimes called Chachmas Tima or Moichus Tima. Here he's calling Hamshach and Alamas, meaning as the Seichel flows from its source in the Hamshach and Alamas. So the Seichel that flows is based on a particular structure in the supraconscious, in the concealed Hamshacha of the source of Seichel. I'll explain this in a moment. Like it says elsewhere. For example, we know Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is the reason that their minds work. One is more lenient, Beis Hillel, and Hillel more lenient, and Shammai more stringent, more severe, is because they came from Chesed and Gvura. Hillel's neshama is rooted in Chesed, and therefore, when he heard Shmai Vavtaya and their teacher teach, he heard the flow came in the Seichel through Chesed. For Hillel, for Shammai, it was through Gvura. What do we see from that? That even before they actually are conscious of their ideas, they're wired that way. The very koyach of Seichel, in its source, even in its supraconscious, in its concealed state, has a certain seer, and according to that seer, that's how the Seichel will flow. And this has nothing to do with the physical brain. This has to do with the very faculty, with the spiritual faculty of that Seichel. In other words, no two people's Seichel is necessarily alike, not just due to the physical part of it. You could say there's differences because one person is, let's say, short, one person is tall. One person has brown eyes, one person has blue eyes. But here we're talking about that the Seichel itself, even the Oyer HaSeichel, which actually is a topic he spoke about all in the beginning of Ayin Beis, even the Oyer HaSeichel has a tziyur and a hagbala. That's what he wants to say. So in other words, what we're saying that when the Seichel comes into the physical brain, the limitation is not just mitzad that, the koyach itself also has parameters and a finite structure. That's the hagam. It's not really a question, it's a qualification, which he's going to still continue to explain, because then what is the difference between the hagbala, the limitation of the very faculty from its source, and the way it enters into the actual physical mind? That he's going to explain momentarily. But that's what he's saying right now. So he's now going to answer, or he's going to now explain the distinction. So what we've established is that the Hagbala is not just due to the Keli, it's also due to the Eira Seichel. And now he says, Hine, however, Eina Deme, Klal, you can't at all compare Hagbala Sakayach Mitzad Atzma La Hagbala Shemitzad HaKeli. The Hagbala of the Kayach that we just explained on its own, and the Hagbala, the limitation and the way it's defined and confined due to the container. In this case, the Moyach Chemer Moyach Gashmi, the physical brain. The Hagbala Sakayach Mitzad Atzma, here's the difference. The limitation of the Kayach on its own, Ein Hagbala Mamish, is not really an actual limit. Because this limit is in the neshama even before it manifests in the body. So even when the neshama is in Gan Eden, what we spoke before, and has nothing to do with the physical body, it has a tremendous gilui. So you can't call it a hagbala mamash. Like he says, so even though it does have a particular tziyur, like we just said, Gvura, Chesed was just an example I gave. It could be other ways of explaining it as well. But the bottom line is, he still understands Mohusa Eir Elikiba Ganed, the very personality of the godly energy in Gan Eden. So what do we see from this? That even though, yes, it has a tziyur, it has definition, so to speak, but it's still somewhat ethereal, and therefore you don't call it Hagbala Mamish. Now you may recall, I mentioned this a number of times. In Ayin Beis, very often, he uses the word Mamish and not Mamish. Like when you say Hagbala, it's either limited or not limited. That's true when you speak in very simple terms. But when you speak in more dakazdik, in more subtle ways of understanding things. You could have something that's Hagbola Mamish, literally. They say a chair is 5 inches long. That's Hagbola Mamish. You could have a Hagbola, meaning that it has definition. It's not completely shapeless or seamless, but the definition is not Hagbola Mamish as we would define true parameters. So that's what he's saying right now. Like, for example, let's go back to Chesed and Gvura. In Atzilus, even though it has 10 spheres, we say Esses spheres, 10 spheres, and that means it's Hagbola. Chochmah is not Bina, and Chesed is not Gvura. He said Giluyim Protim. Yet, in Atzilus, it's called Elikus. It's the Chesed of Elikus, and it's the Gvura of Elikus. So on one hand, it's definitely godliness as it's flowing through the lens, a structure of kindness and not of judgment or severity, Gvura. But it's still, the focus there is on the Elikus, on the godliness. So really, is it more the Elikus of it, or is it more the shape? In Bria, Yitzir, Nasiya, Chesed and Gvura start taking on far more shape, definitely in this world. So even though we have a faculty called Chesed, but it's far more limited. In Atzilus, it actually says that Chesed is Ein Sof Lehishpashtuse, meaning even though it's Chesed and Gvura, but it goes endless. Chesed and Bria, Yitzir, Nasiya, and especially down below, is not endless. So what's in common? They both are Chesed, but one is Bli Gvul Chesed, one is Gvul Chesed. We learned this earlier as well, a number of pages back. So is it a Hagbola or not a Hagbola? If you said it's Chesed and not Gvura mitzad that, there's a definition. But the Chesed itself, because God is unlimited, his kindness is unlimited. Whereas human kindness or created kindness has a limitation, because everything in this world has a beginning and an end. Just to explain a bit more. So on one hand, it's true the koyach has a tzir, like he says, even before it comes into the physical, the container. Nevertheless, it's not Hagbola Mamish, because it's there in the neshama even before it comes in the guf, and there the neshama and that faculty is able to appreciate the mahus of elikus. If it was Hagbola Mamish, it wouldn't be able to. So it's able to understand mahus el-ki b'gan eden. But ayamashin is bar le'il. But Dibra Maschal Nosei Aleph. Okay, he's referring to us to what I just also mentioned. In the beginning of Ayin Beis Mamish, Nosei Aleph is literally page 23 and on. Talking about literally the early parts of Ayin Beis. And what does he say? The Esses Spiritus Shebe'er Heim B'chinas Pshitus Legabe HaKelim. That even though the Oyer also has Shiur, also has some form of definition, but compared to the Keli, it's pshitus. So it's there in a subtle form, but it's really the focus there is on the oir. It would be like something, I'll just give an example for it. I'm speaking now ideas. So there's two things happening whenever there's speech going on. The same thing in writing. We read these words, these letters on the page. The keli is the word that I'm using, or the letters on the page. The oir is the idea that's being conveyed through the words. So it's very clear that the idea is also limited, because we're talking now about a particular idea. We're not talking about things we talked about 20 pages back or 5 pages back, a very particular idea. But there's a difference between how it's defined by the oyer and how it's defined by the keli. The letters are very precise. You can really, they actually have physical parameters. I'm using real expressions, aleph, beis, gimel, or in English words. And here are the Hebrew letters, you actual physical letters with very real strong definition. There's no question it's Hagbola. But the idea, even though there's Hagbola in the idea because it's a defined idea, but the idea really, what dominates there is the energy of the idea, the intensity of the concept. What you're hearing when I speak right now is not really my words. You're hearing the idea conveyed by the words. If you went and concentrated, you can actually say, okay, what words is he using? Or the mimer, what words are being used? But then you're focusing on the keli. If you focus on the oyer, it also has definition, but the main dominant feature there is the concept that's being conveyed. And the concept, even though it's a defined concept, is far less limited than the very words you use to convey that concept. You can use a lot of examples for this, So compared to the kelim, the Eir, even though it has Shiur, like the is pshit. It's the same thing here. Even though the koyach also has Shiur on its own from its source, but compared to where it comes into the brain, into the physical mind, and the same thing with other faculties. Let's say the power of vision. Vision is not sound. Sight is not sound. Seeing something is not hearing it. And yet, when it comes into the physical eye, it's actually fully limited because there's a real container. Same thing with hearing in the air. Whereas the power of vision, even though it's defined as vision and not sound and not hearing, yet it's somewhat unlimited or more ethereal and less defined because of it didn't yet enter the keli, or I should say, because compared to the keli, it's still in a form of, relatively speaking, pshittas. It's not like pshittas hanefesh. Remember earlier he said the nefesh is completely muslal even from the faculties, because the nefesh doesn't have any shape and form. Not even, you can't call the soul made up of sight or sound or mind or intellect or emotions. That's complete pshittas, lifiyerech again. Whereas the faculties are something in between. On one hand, there's definition. On the other hand, they remain still somewhat removed from real limitation and agbola. That's what he said so far. Mashenken agbola sakeli, he agbola mamish. By contrast, the definition or the confinement and the parameters of the container, that we call agbola mamish. Not, the other we said not agbola mamish. This is an actual agbola because that's the whole purpose of the keli. The kop nepnit mer, like when we say in Yiddish, he's using expression that the mind cannot contain more. Like when a person is, let's say, studying and learning, and the teacher is conveying an idea or he's reading something, and he stops and says, my container is full. The cup net nishmet, I can't contain right now more. Let me digest what I've learned so far, and then I can then absorb more. So what are you saying? That the keli of the mind simply has a limit. You just like you can't fill your stomach more than the stomach allows, even if you'd want to. The mind also is that way. He's not saying the mind has a limitation, how many ideas fit in the mind. But when you're learning something, because you're dealing with a physical mind, the kop nepnit mer. And that's due to agbola sakeli. Even though the koyach haseichel could continue to flow, but because we're human beings and the eir is in the keli ultimately comes to a point where it can't take more right now. It can't contain more for this moment.
How are you translating pshittas here? How would you translate it?
I said ethereal. I said sublime, subtle. There are many different ways. Not as tangible.
More expansive, less limited?
No, I would not use that word.
Uh-huh. Okay. But the idea is that it's less bounded, no?
Yeah, that's what we're discussing.
Okay.
I just gave a whole bunch of examples from Eir compared to Keli. You have to use examples. I wouldn't focus on the words. I'd focus on the understanding of it. Find examples where you could relate to it. I gave a few examples from speech, from writing, from Eir and Keli in general, like he says here. Okay, so that covers that. So back to the point, bottom line is, when the faculty comes into the human body, into the faculty in the soul comes into the body, and each faculty in its particular location, there's a concealment and a limitation, even compared to the limitation of the koyach itself that we just explained in the parentheses. So now he continues. So far he said two things. Remember, three things he mentioned earlier that happens. It comes back Shama ubagbola. Bakshama bagbola bislapshu zeis. 1 second. Oh, he said 3. Machshir chalae mailim magbil emeneya. Okay, comes back Shama ubagbola. So now he explained the Hakbala. Before he explained the Aksham, it looks like he's going back and saying, but Eir HaSeichel, going back to the way the Seichel, but what is it happens to it? In other words, what is the shift that happens to the pure power, the faculty itself, as it manifests in a body? He says, the Eir HaSeichel bo b'Akshama. It comes in a more substantial, I would say, more substance-oriented, more material, tangible and palpable form. The seichel as it is on its own, like we learned before, since it's not confined and is not shining through anything physical. The neshamas in Gan Eden don't have a physical body. So the mind is at work it's completely unfettered and unbound by any of the physical definitions of this existence. So the neshama, so the koyach haseichel of the neshama is capable of really spreading its wings. Besides the fact that it doesn't have to deal with the physical elements of a body, fatigue, hunger, pain, all the limitations of a physical body that we learned, but also the seichel itself doesn't have to go and see things through a physical reality. So all it sees is spirituality. All it understands, I should say, and all it experiences is spirituality. So it sees spirituality on its own. The neshama, as it comes into a body, even though it's still spiritual, but it now looks through the physical eyes of this world, and it hears things through physical sounds. And the mind itself is now manifest in a physical brain. So there's a certain physical layer, you could say garment, that is now manifests, that the seichel is manifest in. Like he says, to the point that the mind can now understand a real physical thing. If you showed, for example, a clock, a physical clock, to a neshama in Gan Eden, or for that matter, any physical items, it wouldn't know what it is, because it doesn't relate to physical matter. In this world, we can actually have seichel gashmi, which means the seichel around physical things. Science, dissecting physical matter, phenomenon, and so on. So on one hand, it's seichel. You're still using seichel, but it's a seichel gashmi. It's not a seichel ruchni alone, meaning about ruchnis. It's not about godliness itself. It's about this physical reality. Because the seichel, the koyach ha-seichel, has addressed itself and is now assumed the properties of the physical faculty called the brain, the mind. So this is the fact that it can understand Gashmis, but also the way it understands Ruchnius. When this seichel is learning Torah or learning about God, it's not quite the way it understands God as it is when it's unbound by and unlimited by the body. Like he said, the muhus of the Ethereal or the mitzias of the Ethereal. The gam, and additionally, and also, haskola ruchnius, afilashi b'chinas avshota, ene berach klal legabe ruchnius haskola dukeich hasechel shemetzaratzma. So there's one aspect that the seichel comes in akshama, and things are therefore defined. And the best proof of it, before I read the v'gam, let me just elaborate a moment. When we try to grasp and think about godliness, we're always, whether we like it or not, we're always somewhat physicalizing it, if that's the right word in English, because that's what we relate to. That's why so often, even when we're discussing ideas here in this class, because we're so defined by time and space that when we think about about these ideas, we also think of it in our terms until someone reminds you that you're talking about something that's not quite that physical. So, for example, it says in the Torah, God says, God saw, God heard. We know God doesn't have eyes and doesn't have ears. So, Dibra Torah b'loshen b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of man. So it's really only a language thing. It's not meant to be physicalized. We're not supposed to be megashemit, but the nature of a person is that's how we think about God. Until you contemplate on it and you're reminded that God is not just some superior being, a completely different entity. And you have to go through a whole yediyas hashlila to negate that when you say God has certain features, it's not quite like we have features. I think I've given this example. I remember once speaking about how Chassidus in yeshiva is not taught necessarily the best possible way. That when we began learning Chassidus as kids, no one ever told us that you have to shift the way you think about things. We learned Chassidus like you learn Nigla. There's 39 malachas that you're not supposed to do on Shabbos. There are 10 spheres. Just two different set of numbers. Or when you hear about the Olamus, the worlds, you think, you know what, like 4 planets. Just like there's Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, or Mars and Earth, the same way we think, okay, there's Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Nasir. Or like when our mashpia would want to amuse himself, he would ask the beginner students, he'd say, so where exactly is Atzilus, between which planets? And I remember one person said he thinks it's between Neptune and Uranus. Or in what century did the Tzimtzum Arishan happen? And I remember a guy saying he thinks it was in the 2nd century. Until you come to realize these are not defined by space and time as we know it. But you need to be explained that. Because we are creatures of this physical world. So I remember a teacher from one of the yeshivas asked me if he can bring some of the students and their 15-year-old kids, boys, who are beginning to learn Chassidus, and maybe give them a primer, like an introduction. So they came here, right here, a group of them, and I took an apple out of the refrigerator and I put it on the table here. And I asked the boys, I said, tell me how many apples could fit on this table. So they wisely understood. They measured the apple, let's say 2-3 inches. They made a quick estimate of how the square footage of this table. And then you figure out that 300 apples, 500 apples, whatever. That's it. You can't fit more, you can't fit less, because everything is defined clearly. Once you reach the limit, you reach the limit. Then I said, okay, let me ask you now this question. How many ideas can fit into the brain? Now, the brain is a little larger than the palm of my hand, much smaller than this table, no doubt. The human body is smaller than the table, let alone just the brain. How many ideas can fit into the brain? And I remember seeing in their eyes that they suddenly had to do a paradigm shift of thinking. Because I said, so why can't you tell me? Why don't you do the same calculation? How big is an idea? An apple is 2-3 inches. How big is an idea? And then how many ideas can fit into a brain? My point was, of course, was to take them out of the physical way of understanding space, spatial thinking, and understand there's a thing called conceptual space, or if you wish, spiritual space, which means ideas don't occupy space like an apple does. They do occupy something. 2 + 2 is 4 is an idea, a concept. However, it doesn't take up physical space. And the brain is not just a storage house that's storing apples. The brain has the capacity to have billions and billions of ideas. How's that possible when the table, which is far larger than the brain, can only contain 500 apples. So then you come to realize that you're thinking ba'akshama, because that's what we do. I'm just giving you an example of what happens to seichel when it comes in Gan Eden. They don't have this issue altogether, because there are no apples and there are no tables, and b'chlal there's no physical space. Everything is spiritual, and that's its natural state. I would say the other way around. For souls in Gan Eden, it's as novel. Physical time and space is as novel to them as for us, spiritual time and space is novel for us. Just as we have to work hard in trying to understand something so ethereal and abstract, they would have to work hard to try to understand this reality, this world. That's why it says that the morning after Simchas Torah, the Malachim always come to clean up Gan Eden in the morning. When the Jews start davening, the Malachim respond and daven. But Simchas Torah, the Jews sleep a little late because they danced all night. So the Malachim and Gan Eden, and they suddenly see strange objects. It's a story from the Baal Shem Tov. What do they see? They see sandals and shoes and soles. They never saw anything. They thought, what kind of foreign objects are here? So they went to the expert on the Jewish people, Malach Michal, and they asked him, what is this? So he said, these are the souls from Chernobyl. These are the souls from souls as an S-O-L-E-S, the shoes. These are the worn out souls from the dancing of the Jews in Chernobyl and from the Jews in Vitebsk and the Jews in the Rodna, whatever, all the different cities. Why? Because for spiritual angels, for them, physical reality is just as novel as spiritual entities for us physical beings. But being that we do have a neshama, we could relate to it, the mitzias of it at least. So I'm just explaining a bit what happens to seichel as it comes into this hakshama. That's the first thing he says, that it comes by hakshama to the point they could actually understand physical things. But then he says, v'gama askola ruchnis, and also a so-called ethereal or a spiritual concept. Even when it's not a very tangible, it's a more abstract and less that tangible, less palpable idea. It's not comparable at all to the ethereal nature of the idea as it is due to the faculty of seichel on its own when it doesn't manifest inside the brain, the physical brain. So what we see from this is that it goes through a serious descent from the way it is on its own, the neshama, the koiches on neshama, and the way it manifests inside us. And by understanding this, this helps us actually grow, because we don't come to deceive ourselves into thinking we have it all figured out. We have everything understood. Even when you're learning deep concepts like what we're learning here in Ayin Beis, it's still through the lens of your body, even if it's a more spiritual idea. And then he continues, this is not just with seichel, v'chein hu b'chol ha'keiches. This is so the case, so is the case with all the faculties. K'moy koyach hariyah, like the power of vision. Shemetzadatz me koyach ruchni. On its own, it's an ethereal faculty. Like he says, litfes muhusa ruchni, the capacity to grasp something that is more ethereal. That's really what Riyah is in its source. It's not about seeing physical objects, it's about seeing, perceiving. The muhusa ruchni kumashkosav makamachet. The in sheraya v'shemas hakruzim. Like it speaks elsewhere about seeing and hearing the kruzim, the baskel, the kruzim are the announcements from heaven that come out from heaven. So there's seeing and there's hearing, but all of it is still on a spiritual level. When you say a soul sees something, you don't mean it's seeing a physical object. It's perceiving with a clarity of sight a reality of something. I'd have to look up what he means with Roya Shemas HaKruzim. I think it talks about seeing something and hearing for sure. We know that every day there's a baskel, there's a voice that comes out from heaven that the mazel of the neshama hears. But there's also, I think, something that it sees. I'd have to look up what that means. But Ayin Mashin is bar leil, and this too, in the beginning of Ayin Beis, the Inyan Royen es Hanishma. He spoke there about what happened by Matan Torah, the synesthesia, that they saw the sounds. Now, what does that mean? A sound can't be seen. But when you're talking about Riyah Ruchnius, you're seeing perceiving the message of the sounds in a way that's even stronger than hearing it. Because hearing is still somewhat removed. Seeing has a certain hisamtus and truth. This was all discussed earlier in Ayin Beis. The point he's making here, that's Riyah on its own. That it's a Riyah Kayach Ruchni, Litves Musa Ruchni. So when you say, for example, that neshamas gevoyos, high neshamas, have a riyah and elikus, not just they hear. When you hear something, it's like from a distance, someone's telling you something that they saw. So it's one step away from the experience. You're hearing the story, the narrative. But when you see, it's like seeing it directly. The Jews saw elikus by Matan Torah. They saw with their own eyes. What they see? It wasn't a physical sight, it was a perception that the Ayin Ruchni, the Ayin in this neshama, is able to perceive something as true as when you, like seeing is believing. When you see something, there's a certain clarity. That's why Ein Eid Nasa Dayan. A witness can be a judge. If you witnessed a crime, or you witnessed a scene, you cannot sit in judgment, because once you've seen something, it's so real for you, you no longer can maintain objectivity. That's the din. That's one of the proofs Chassidus brings why Riyah is stronger than listening. The judge, is hearing evidence and hearing the witness speak, but hearing does not affect you. Hearing, you're not there. If you saw something, you can never know. Maybe you didn't see it exactly accurate, but it leaves an impression on you that it's very difficult for you to step back. If you hear a witness, you could always cross-examine and challenge because you didn't see it yourself. So that's the perception of Riyah. And another thing, ubabchinas bligvul, like we learned before again. One hand, it's ruchni, the muhus ruchni, and the other that it's without limitations. It's not defined like it is when it comes down. Ubislapshus b'chemer ha'ayin, and this power of vision, just like we said before with the power of seichel, when it manifests and enters a chemer ha'ayin, in the very substance, in the very physical matter of the eye, tefesses dover gashmi. Now this vision, this power of vision in the soul, that without the body would only relate to spiritual things, now grasps and sees physical things. And the second thing, ubechinas hagbala, and it's now also limited. You could only see that far. Just like the mind, like he said, the cup kenish farnemen, just like the brain has limits, the eye also has limits. You could have 20/20 vision. The eye can get blurred. The guy can physical eye can limit the way you see things clearly. Here he's not talking due to age. Just the physical eye, even a child, even a person who has complete perfect vision, there's still a limit. How far is your vision go to see from a distance? You can only see that far. Even if there was no blocks, if you're standing on a rooftop, on a mountain, you could see miles perhaps, but you can't see thousands of miles. There's a point where you can't see further. So Riyah is Bagbola. The move on, he adds down the parenthesis that it's understood. The Lule Chemera Ayin Hoya Hariyah Bilti Mugbelis. He just adds that it's self-understood. That it's understood that without the Chemera Ayin, if the vision was not limited by the physical eye, the Riyah would be without limits. You'd be able to see endlessly. Now, of course, you could ask the question, how do we know that? How could you prove that? The Rebbe Rashab just says, move on. Now, his logic is, because he's saying the Chomer Ayin itself is what caused that limit. And even earlier when he said that the koyach itself also has a limit, he said, no, it's a limit, but it's not a agbola mamish. It's not a limit in how much it could see. It's a limit that it's vision and not sound. It's vision and not movement. It's vision and not seichel. Well, like he said before, that it has some siyur, but it doesn't have agbola. Like we said before, chesed of atzilus can go endless. That's what he's saying in the move on here.
Not vision, not sound. Vision, not chokhmah. Because sound, he said, is included in vision.
Why not? Vision is also not sound. That's its limitation.
He said before, voya v'sheimas, because vision ruchnius means you absorb. So this is including sound.
It's the same thing. Vision is not sound, means it has a limit. That's all I'm trying to say. Yeah, okay. Let's continue, and then I'll stop, and we'll have, oh, it's already 10:30. Wow. You know what? I'm going to stop here then again. Anybody want to ask anything? I'm going to stop here at the end of this parentheses. The next section is going to be about in general avodah, that the avodah below is limited compared to the avodah above. It's going to conclude with that. Yeah, and then he's going to say how this is an example for choshech. If you look at the end of the paragraph, he concludes with how it's a mashal that choshech has both things. It has its own entity, the kelim, and it has the fact that it conceals that which enters there, like we're just explaining at length. So he's gonna sum it up at the end of the paragraph. But because of time limits, let me just stop here. Any questions?
Thank you very much. You explained that this is a very deep thing. You explained it in such a clear way.
Thank you. Try my best. Any questions, comments? Any other comments, that is? I mean, I could read it, but I don't want to rush it, so we'll do it on Sunday. We'll do it more patiently. Good. Okay, so we're by the, 7 lines from the end of the paragraph on page 13.